I was standing in the hallway outside the delivery room when I first saw her. My mother was on the bed, pale and exhausted, and this woman, small, weary, eyes sharp as sewing needles, was whispering something to the nurse. She didn't notice me, or maybe she pretended not to. I was 10 years old then, too young to understand the weight of what I was seeing, but old enough to remember the way her voice curled around the words, "I'll handle this." They called her Morag MacLeod, the village midwife. Everyone spoke of her with reverence, as if she was half saint, half sorceress. People said babies born in her hands grew up strong. Nobody ever spoke about the ones who didn't. For years, Morag was just a name in the back of my mind, tied to the night my sister Ela was born. Ela was different from the start, quieter, watchful, like she'd been given the eyes of someone much older. She'd stare at my parents sometimes like she didn't recognize them, like she was memorizing their faces. I'd catch her watching me too, her gaze fixed and unblinking, until I felt compelled to look away. I put it down to childish strangeness, until the night she turned 20-1. It was late, just the two of us in the kitchen. The rest of the family had gone to bed after the small celebration. Ela was nursing a cup of tea, tapping her nails against the ceramic in a steady, deliberate rhythm. Then she said, as casually as if she were asking me to pass the sugar, "Do you ever wonder if you're in the right family?" I laughed at first, thinking it was some philosophical question, but she didn't smile. Her voice dropped, low and certain. "I'm not supposed to be here. I was meant for someone else." Her words lodged in me like a thorn. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound light, but my stomach tightened. She didn't answer. She just sipped her tea and kept tapping. Over the next week, she started leaving the house at odd hours, slipping out after midnight, coming back at dawn. I tried following her once, keeping my distance, but she walked like she knew the exact route even in the dark. She led me out past the village, up a narrow path to the old churchyard. I stayed back, watching her kneel in front of a weathered stone and place something on it, small, white bundles wrapped in cloth. I never got close enough to see what was inside. Finally, I cornered her one night. She was in her room, packing a satchel with the same neat, precise movements I remembered from the kitchen. "You're scaring me," I told her. "Tell me what's going on." She zipped the bag shut, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Morag MacLeod switched me at birth. My real parents lived in Strathglass. They're both dead now. But I know where she is, and I'm going to make her tell me why." The name made my skin prickle. I hadn't thought about Morag in years. "That's insane," I said, but my voice cracked. She shook her head. "I have proof." She pulled a folded paper from the satchel, a birth record, yellowed with age. My mother's name wasn't on it. Neither was my father's. There was another woman's name, one I didn't recognize, and an address in a village 30 miles away. The next morning, she was gone. My parents thought she'd gone back to university early, but I knew better. I waited until nightfall and took my father's old bike. The road to Morag's cottage was narrow and winding, the kind of road where the trees lean in like they're eavesdropping. When I arrived, the place looked abandoned, roof sagging, windows clouded with grime, but there was light in one upstairs window. I left the bike by the gate and crept around to the back, where the earth was soft and recently disturbed, a row of small mounds covered with stones. The shapes were too short for graves, too short for adults. I pressed myself against the wall and listened. Inside, I heard voices, Ila's, sharp and angry, and Morag's, calm and measured, like she was reciting a prayer. I moved to the side window and peered in. They were sitting at a table. Between them was a wooden box, the kind you might keep sewing supplies in. Morag opened it slowly, revealing a row of tiny bracelets, hospital tags, each with a baby's name written in faded ink. She ran her fingers over them like they were pearls. "You were never meant for them," Morag was saying. "They weren't right for you. You were sickly, fragile. The woman I gave you to had strong blood. You survived because of me." Ila's hands curled into fists. "You ruined my life." Morag smiled faintly. "I gave you life." I pushed the door open without thinking. They both turned toward me, but neither looked surprised. Ila's face was pale, her eyes bright with a kind of feverish clarity. Morag's expression didn't change at all. "You should go home," Marag told me, her voice still that same low, commanding tone. This is between us. No, I said, though my legs felt like they might give way if you switched her. Then what about me? Was I? You were born where you belong. She cut in. Some things are set right at birth. Others need adjusting. She rose from the table, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for her age. I noticed, for the first time, a long, thin knife lying beside the box. My chest tightened. Don't, I said. Stepping between them, Hila didn't move. She just kept staring at Marag, breathing hard. Marag's eyes flicked to the door, then back to us. You have no idea what would have happened to her if I hadn't intervened. You can't imagine the kind of parents she would have had. Drunkards. Violent. She was a mistake waiting to happen. You don't get to decide that, Hila snapped. Marag's smile faded. For a moment, the room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking in the hall. Then, without warning, Hila lunged. I don't know if she was reaching for the knife or for Marag's throat, but the chair tipped. The box clattered to the floor, and the bracelets spilled across the wood like scattered teeth. I grabbed Hila, pulling her back, but she was stronger than I'd ever felt her. Marag stumbled, catching herself on the table, and her hand closed over the knife. My stomach flipped. I shoved Hila toward the door. Go, I yelled, but she didn't. She was locked on Marag, her eyes wild. Marag stepped forward, the blade low at her side. I corrected fate, she said, her voice almost gentle, and I'll do it again if I must. Something in me broke then, not fear, not anger, but a kind of desperate clarity. I grabbed the kettle from the stove and swung it hard. It hit the table, sending boiling water across Marag's hands. She screamed, dropping the knife, and I kicked it away. Hila grabbed my arm, and we ran. We didn't stop until we reached the bike. We rode double, my legs screaming with the effort, the cold air burning my lungs. Behind us, the light in Marag's window still glowed, steady as a watchful eye. Back home, Hila locked herself in her room. She wouldn't talk about what happened. Not to me, not to our parents. I buried the truth too, telling myself it was over. But 2 weeks later, Marag was found dead in her cottage. The cause was listed as natural, though I couldn't reconcile that with the image of her standing in that room, knife in hand, eyes bright with purpose. The police found dozens of hospital bracelets in her home, each with a name and a date. Some matched children in the village, some didn't match anyone at all. My parents never learned about Hila's birth record, and she never showed it to anyone again. But she changed after that night, quieter, like she'd been carrying a weight. That finally settled. Sometimes I wonder about the lives of those other children, the ones she adjusted. Did they ever feel the way Hila did? Like they'd been dropped into a life that didn't quite fit? Did they ever go looking for answers? I still see Marag in my dreams sometimes, sitting at that table, running her fingers over those names, and in the dream, she always looks up and says the same thing in that calm, measured voice. I gave you life. You owe me everything. I wake up with the taste of iron in my mouth, my hands clenched tight, and the unshakable thought that maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe fate is something people like her can bend, just enough to change the course of a life. But then I remember the rows of tiny graves behind her house, the bracelets scattered like bones, and I tell myself it's better not to know what might have been. Because if I let myself think about it too long, I start to wonder whose life I'm really living and whether it was ever meant to be mine at all. Story number 2. I was 17 when I met him, and I can still hear the sound of his workshop door shutting behind me, like it's happening right now. It wasn't loud, not even a slam, just a soft, deliberate click that made the hair on my neck rise. I'd been in Lucerne for a music competition, my first trip abroad alone. My mother was overprotective and had called me every hour, but she couldn't be there. I was carrying my violin case, dressed in my black rehearsal clothes, and walking back from the rehearsal hall when I noticed the little wooden sign, Luthier, master violins repaired and made to order. I'd been looking for a place to fix a loose fine tuner. That's all I wanted. He opened the door before I even knocked. Tall, thin, white hair tied neatly at the back, wearing a beige apron flecked with varnish stains. You play, he said, nodding to the case. His accent was Swiss German, but soft. I told him about the competition, about the tuner problem, and he smiled with this precision, like he was measuring me. "Comin', quick job, no charge." The inside smelled like resin and something sweeter like old wood soaked in honey. Violins hung on the walls, their polished bodies catching what little light there was. He worked in silence at first, adjusting the tuner with quick, deft hands. Then he asked me to play something to test it. I played a bit of Bach. His eyes didn't leave my fingers. When I finished, he didn't say good or bad. He just said, "You have discipline. That is rare in the young." That's when he offered to show me something. He led me up a narrow set of stairs at the back. The attic smelled dustier, heavier. There were no windows, only a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center stood 3 life-sized mannequins, or I thought they were mannequins. They were dressed in period clothing, each holding a violin. One wore a pale yellow dress, another a boy's school uniform, the third a dark velvet gown. The faces, God, the faces were too real. The skin wasn't smooth like plastic. It had texture, freckles, faint lines, pores. Their glass eyes were set deep, looking nowhere but somehow still watching. "This is my gallery," he said, brushing dust from the dress of the yellow one. "Each one, a musician I've preserved." He said it as casually as if he'd said photographed. I laughed nervously, waiting for him to tell me they were just wax sculptures. He didn't. Instead, he stepped closer to me, holding a small jar. Inside was a cloudy liquid and something pale floating in it. "A finger," he said plainly. From the first, my body locked. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. I'd seen wax figures before. These weren't wax. The nails were cracked like real nails, the hairline at the temples thin and uneven. My stomach turned. I told him I had to go, that my teacher was waiting. He smiled again, that same precise smile, and said, "You remind me of my last pupil. Stay, play for me one more time." I said no and moved toward the stairs. That's when he stepped in front of me, calm but blocking the way. He asked me about my parents, whether they knew where I was. I lied and said my father was coming to pick me up any minute. His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. He reached into his apron pocket and I heard metal clink. For a moment I thought he had a knife, but it was a tuning fork. He tapped it against the table, and the sound rang in the air, this pure, high tone that made the room feel smaller. "Do you know," he said, "that a violin and the human voice vibrate almost the same?" I didn't answer. My heartbeat was so loud I could barely hear the words coming out of my own mouth. I told him again I had to go, forcing a smile, pretending I wasn't terrified. He tilted his head, then stepped aside. I walked down the stairs, slowly, not daring to run until I was at the door. When I reached for the handle, it didn't turn. He had locked it. I spun around. He was halfway down the stairs now, holding a bow, not the kind for shooting arrows, but for a violin. The horsehair was stained darker in the middle. He said, "It is not finished yet. I need someone who can play my final composition." I backed away, pressing myself against the door. I tried to reason with him, offering to come back tomorrow, to bring my teacher. He shook his head slowly. "They never come back when they leave. You won't either." I knew then that if I didn't get out right now, I wouldn't leave at all. My eyes darted to the side wall where a stack of violin cases leaned. One was open, and inside was a small screwdriver. I grabbed it without thinking, kept it hidden in my sleeve. I forced myself to smile and said, "I'll play one piece, just one." He stopped a few feet from me, suspicious, but then he nodded and handed me one of his violins. I sat on the stool near the door, the screwdriver still hidden in my sleeve, and began to play. My hands were shaking so much that the notes came out rough, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes closed as he listened, leaning in slightly, almost entranced. That was my chance. While playing, I slid the screwdriver into the lock behind me. It was clumsy, my bow hand trembling, my left hand pressing strings, but I felt the mechanism shift when the lock gave. I didn't even stop playing. I dropped the bow, flung the door open, and ran. I heard him shout behind me, then the thud of his footsteps on the wooden floor. The street outside was empty. I didn't look back. I just ran toward the bus stop at the end of the block. I jumped on the first bus that came. Didn't even check where it was going. I sat in the back, clutching my violin case like a lifeline. My hands were still shaking, my chest tight. I didn't cry until the bus was halfway across town. That night, I told my competition roommate. She didn't believe me at first, thought I'd misunderstood, that maybe it was some weird art installation. I swore to her what I'd seen. We went to the police together. They listened politely, took my statement, and said they'd look into it. 2 days later, just before my performance, an officer came to my hotel. He told me they'd gone to the address and found the shop closed. Windows boarded up from the inside. No sign of him. No mannequins. No attic. Even the workshop table was gone. He'd cleared it out in less than 48 hours. I still had to play in the competition, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I came in third, not that it mattered. I flew home the next morning. For years, I told myself I'd imagined it, that maybe my mind had twisted some strange encounter into something darker. But last year, I was in Vienna for work, browsing a flea market. I saw a violin on a stall, old, scratched, but beautiful. I picked it up, and there inside the F-hole, on the inner wood was a tiny carved name, Clara to 1997. It was the same name stitched on the hem of the yellow dress. I put the violin down and walked away without looking back. I didn't buy it. I didn't ask the seller where he got it. I just left, because I knew if I started asking questions, I might find him, or worse, he might find me. Story number 3. I was halfway through my trip across Central Asia when I ended up in Samarkand. You know how some places just pull you in without trying? The old streets, the faded blue tiles, the smell of spices, everything felt like it had been sitting in the same spot for centuries, waiting for me to walk through it. I had no real plan that day, just wandering. That's when I saw this tiny souvenir shop tucked between a carpet cellar and a place that sold dried fruit. No bright signs, no flashy displays, just a narrow wooden door and a small, dusty window with a few strange masks hanging inside. The masks weren't like the colorful ones you see in tourist stalls. These were pale, almost flesh-toned, with an eerie smoothness, and the eyes were cut just a little too wide. I can't explain it, but something about them made me pause. My plan was to walk past, but then the door creaked open before I could move on, and a voice in accented but perfect English said, "You have an eye for detail. Come in." I should have kept walking, God, I should have. But I didn't. The inside of the shop was cramped, smelling faintly of oil and something metallic. Shelves lined the walls, each holding more of those strange masks, along with carved trinkets, animals, faces, hands. Behind the counter stood the shopkeeper, a tall, thin man with long fingers and skin so pale it almost blended into the masks behind him. His eyes were the color of old copper, sharp and fixed right on me. "You travel alone," he said, not asking, just stating. I laughed a little and nodded, trying to brush it off, but I felt my stomach tighten. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the counter. "Then you understand the importance of something unique, something that lasts when everything else is gone." He reached behind him and took down one of the masks. "This," he said, "is from a French traveler. He came through here in '97. Still perfect, don't you think?" I thought he meant it was modeled after a real person, maybe even a death mask. I asked what it was made of. He smiled, thin, slow, unsettling, human, he said, almost casually, like he was talking about leather. I let out a short laugh, because what else do you do when someone says that? I thought it was a dark joke, maybe part of his sales pitch to make the mask seem more exotic. He didn't laugh back. He held it out to me. "Feel it." The surface was disturbingly smooth, but it didn't feel like plaster or resin. There was a faint give under my fingertips, like thick, dried leather. I pulled my hand back quickly, telling him it was impressive craftsmanship. He just kept staring. "Would you like to see how it's made?" Something in me wanted to say yes, out of curiosity, but my instincts were screaming no. I told him I had to go meet someone, which was a lie, and turned toward the door. He said, "Not everyone is invited to see the process," his voice low enough that I almost didn't hear it. I mumbled a polite goodbye and stepped outside. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird old man with a creepy hobby. But later, when I passed by that part of town again in the evening, the shop was still lit. The same mask I'd touched earlier was back in the window, and I swear the eyes seemed smaller than before, like the edges had shrunk. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about his hands, the way he had looked at me like I wasn't a customer but something else. I tried to push it out of my head, but the next day, I saw him again. Not in his shop outside my guest house, leaning against the wall, smoking. He didn't come up to me, just watched as I went inside. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my key twice. I told the manager about it, but he just shrugged and said the man was strange, but harmless. I wanted to believe that. Then, 2 nights later, I woke up to a faint scraping sound outside my room. My heart was pounding as I got out of bed. I went to the door and pressed my ear against it. The sound stopped. I opened the door just a crack, and down the hall, I saw him, half in shadow, holding something rolled up under his arm. When he noticed me, he smiled not wide, just enough to make my skin crawl, and walked away without saying a word. That was it. I decided to leave Samarkand the next morning. I packed my bag before sunrise and took a longer route to the station to avoid the street where his shop was, but as I turned a corner, there it was anyway, right in front of me. The door was open, and I could hear a faint humming from inside. I should have walked away, but something pulled me closer, morbid curiosity, I guess. Inside, I saw him at a workbench, his back to me. The smell was stronger this time, sharp and sickly sweet. On the table in front of him was a mask, but it wasn't finished. The edges were still ragged, and I could see stitching along the sides, thick black thread pulling the pieces together. I realized then it wasn't shaped like any mask I'd seen before. It was a face, an actual face, stripped and stretched. The lips were sewn shut, the eyelids missing, leaving empty sockets. My stomach lurched so hard I thought I'd throw up. I must have made a noise because he turned around, holding a curved knife in one hand. "You came back," he said softly. "Good. I was hoping you would." I backed up, my eyes locked on the knife. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice shaking. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "It's better when the traveler is still warm," he said. My breath caught in my throat. I bolted out the door, running without looking back, weaving through alleys until I reached the main road at the station. I bought the first ticket out, didn't care where. I sat there for hours, my bag clutched in my lap, watching every doorway, expecting him to walk in. He never did. It wasn't until weeks later, in another country, that I read about him. A short article online, barely a paragraph. Local craftsman, arrested after remains of multiple foreign travelers found in shop basement. They didn't give details, but they mentioned masks made of biological material. His name wasn't even printed. I didn't need it. I could still see his copper eyes, still hear the way he said human, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and sometimes God. I hate admitting this, I still feel the surface of that mask under my fingers, warm and almost alive, as if it's waiting for me to come back. I will never go back. Not to Samarkand, not to that street, not anywhere near the smell of oil and metal. But every time I travel alone, I catch myself looking in shop windows, wondering if somewhere, someone else is touching a mask that used to be a person. And I think about how easily I could have been hanging on his wall right now, staring out through wide, unblinking eyes at the next traveler who can't resist stepping inside. Story number 4. I was halfway up the creaking attic ladder when I first heard it, a sound like someone running a bow slowly over a string, except it was muted, almost inside my head. My foot froze on the rung. I'd been in that house for a month already, renting the top floor from Frau Keller, an elderly woman who barely spoke English. It was meant to be quiet, cheap, and close to my language school in Lucerne, but the attic was supposed to be locked. She'd told me so herself the day I moved in. With that warning glance that didn't match her smile, I told myself the sound could have been wind. The house was old, wood groaning in the night. But when I pushed the attic hatch open, the smell hit me first, varnish and something faintly sour, like damp clothes left too long. My flashlight beam swept across dust-coated trunks, a line of broken chairs, and then a violin, hanging from a nail by its scroll. like someone had left it mid-repair. The sound stopped. I don't know why I walked toward it. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the way silence after a noise feels heavier. The floorboards flexed under my weight, and that's when I noticed the trapdoor in the far corner. Flush with the floorboards, the edges stained darker than the wood around it. I crouched down, brushed the dust away. It had a small brass ring. For a handle, my pulse thudded in my ears. I was just going to peek, just see. It took both hands to pry it open. The hinges groaned, and cold air pushed up into my face. The smell intensified, varnish, sweat, and something metallic. My flashlight beam caught the top of a narrow staircase. The walls down there weren't wood, but old stone, sweating with moisture. I should have closed it right then, but I didn't. I climbed down, counting 8 steps, each one colder than the last. My light landed on rows of violins, dozens of them, hanging neatly from the walls. Some were polished and gleaming. Others were unfinished, raw wood with strings dangling loose. And then I saw the mannequins. At least, I thought they were mannequins. They sat in chairs along the far wall, each dressed in plain, old-fashioned clothes. Their faces were white, waxy, with glass eyes staring ahead. Something about their skin made my stomach twist. It didn't shine like plastic, and the hair on their heads was real. "Are you lost?" a voice said behind me. I spun. So fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. Frau Keller stood at the bottom of the stairs, her hands clasped neatly, smiling. Her eyes looked brighter in the dim light. I stammered something. I don't even remember what, about hearing a noise. She walked past me like I wasn't there, brushing her fingertips across one of the violins. "Each one is unique," she said softly. "I make them from the finest materials. The soul must be preserved properly. You understand?" I didn't want to. My eyes darted to the mannequins again. Something inside me screamed to get out, but my body felt slow, like my muscles didn't want to listen. She stopped in front of one, a boy in a pale shirt, maybe 12. His head tilted just slightly, and his glass eyes caught my light. His left hand was positioned like it was holding an invisible bow. "This one," she said, "was a prodigy, but children burn so brightly they burn out quickly." She plucked a string on the violin hanging beside him. The note rang sharp and clear, and I swear I saw the corner of the boy's mouth twitch. I muttered that I needed to leave, started backing toward the stairs. She blocked my way without seeming to move. Fast, her smile never broke. "You have good hands," she said, taking my wrist, turning it over to study my fingers. Long, flexible, perfect for the craft. My skin crawled under her touch. I jerked my arm back and shoved past her, climbing the stairs 2 at a time. She didn't follow. Not right away. I could hear her humming below, a slow, methodical tune, as I slammed the attic hatch shut and stumbled down to my room. I didn't sleep that night. I packed my bag, but every time I thought about leaving, I remembered how isolated the house was, how far the walk was to the station, and how she had all the keys at around for in the morning. I heard footsteps overhead, not above my ceiling, but lighter, like they were pacing just outside my door. I gripped the handle of my suitcase and waited for the sound to stop. It did in single quotes t. The next day, I skipped class and went to the police. I tried to explain what I saw, but my German was shaky, and the officer kept frowning like I was overreacting. He wrote something down, promised to send someone, but I could tell he didn't believe me. When I got back to the house, Frau Keller was in the kitchen, smiling over a pot of tea. "The attic is private," she said, like we were discussing laundry. "You understand, yes?" I nodded. Avoiding her eyes, she poured me tea, and I didn't touch it. That night, I locked my door and jammed a chair under the handle. I kept the flashlight beside me in bed. Sometime after midnight, the music started again, faint, sweet, and impossibly close, like someone was playing a violin just outside my window. I pulled the curtain aside. The attic window above mine was open, and in the dim spill of moonlight, I saw one of the mannequins standing there, head tilted down toward me. I don't remember deciding to run. I just remember grabbing my bag and yanking the chair from the door. The hallway was dark, but I didn't care. I bolted for the stairs, my socks sliding on the wood. And then I heard her voice from the attic hatch above. "You'll ruin everything if you leave." Something thudded to the floor behind me, soft but heavy. I didn't look back. The front door was locked, of course, but the latch on the side window in the hallway was loose. I shoved it up, squeezed through, and dropped into the hedge outside. Scratching my arms and face, I ran the whole way to the station, not stopping until I was on a train heading anywhere else. I didn't even check the ticket. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the police in Lucerne. They'd searched the house. They'd found the violins, the mannequins, but they weren't mannequins. They were bodies, preserved, skinned in places, where the wood of the violins had been inlaid with something they wouldn't describe over the phone. One of them was a boy reported missing in 1986. Another was a girl who'd disappeared just last year. They never found Frau Keller. The attic was empty, the house abandoned, but the officer told me, almost reluctantly, that one of the violins was still strung, still in tune, as if someone had played it the night before. I haven't touched a violin since, and sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear that single string note, humming somewhere just beyond the walls. Story number 5. I was 17 when I met him. I was sitting outside the youth shelter in Hobart, pretending to read a tattered paperback I'd stolen from the library, just to keep people from talking to me. He walked past once, then again, like he was testing the air. The third time, he stopped. "You're wasting your eyes on that," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, like he'd been chewing on cigarettes. "I'm a painter. I see faces. You've got one worth painting." At first, I thought he was some creep hitting on me, but he didn't ask for my number or try to touch me. He just stood there, studying me like I was already on a canvas in his mind. Then he told me he had a spare room, hot meals, and work that paid. The shelter had been turning me away every other night because of overcrowding, so I took the bait. His place was on a narrow street that smelled faintly of turpentine even from outside. Inside, it was all white walls and paint-stained floors, except for the main room. That one was huge, 2 walls covered in easels and canvases, 1 wall crammed with bookshelves, and the last with a row of tall windows. There were paintings everywhere, faces mostly, children's faces, some smiling, some frowning, some with expressions I couldn't even name. I told myself it was fine. Artists paint kids all the time. He made me pasta and said the room upstairs was mine. He didn't mention rent, just rules: no going into the basement, no touching the covered canvases stacked against the far wall, and I had to sit for him for 2 hours a day. That was it. The first sitting was almost pleasant. He gave me tea, set me in a high-backed chair by the window, and started sketching. He didn't talk much, except to tell me to hold my head this way or that. He never touched me. After 2 hours, he sent me upstairs with a sandwich and a "good work, lad." On the 3rd day, I noticed the others. It started with a faint cough from somewhere in the house. Not the street, not a neighbor, inside. I paused, listening, and then it was gone. Later, while I was heading to the kitchen, I heard it again, followed by a short, sharp laugh that didn't sound like him. When I asked, he didn't even look up from his palette. "You hear the house settling," he said. "Old timber does that." But the noises got harder to ignore. A scrape like furniture moving across the floor, muffled voices, even what sounded like someone crying. I started checking the upstairs rooms, but they were all empty except for mine. The only place I hadn't looked was the basement. One night, I woke up to footsteps. Not the slow, heavy ones he made, but quick, light, like someone running. They stopped right outside my door. I sat there in the dark, heart pounding, waiting for a knock that never came. The next morning, during my sitting, I noticed something different. The canvas he was working on wasn't just me. Behind my shoulder, half blurred, was the outline of another boy. The shape was so faint I might have missed it if I hadn't been staring. He caught me looking and turned the canvas away. "Focus on your posture," he said sharply. A weaken. I saw her, a girl, maybe 10 or 11, peering from the basement door just as I walked past. She didn't say a word, just vanished into the darkness when she saw me. I froze. That was when it clicked. The coughing, the crying, the quick footsteps. He wasn't living alone. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about her eyes, the way they looked swollen, like she'd been crying for days. By morning, I had a plan. I'd wait until he went out for groceries, then check the basement. When the chance came, my hands were sweating so badly I almost dropped the key. The basement door opened with a dry groan. The smell hit me first, damp concrete, mold, and something sour. The stairs creaked under my weight. At the bottom, I found a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, throwing shadows across the room. There were 3 beds, not real beds, just mattresses on the floor with thin blankets. In the corner sat the girl I'd seen, along with 2 boys. They stared at me like I was a ghost. One of them whispered, "Are you new?" I told them I was staying upstairs, that I didn't know they were here. That's when the smallest boy, who couldn't have been more than 8, said, "He's painting us. He said we can leave when he's done." I wanted to get them out immediately, but before I could think of how, I heard the front door slam upstairs. His footsteps came fast, heavy, heading toward the basement. The girl's face drained of color. "Go," she mouthed. I bolted up the stairs, barely making it into the kitchen before he appeared. He looked at me for a long moment, then smiled too wide. "Soup's on," he said. From then on, the sittings felt different. He was quieter, more intense, his eyes darting to the clock every few minutes. I realized he was painting faster now, more urgently. I also realized that every canvas in that room had a certain look. In the subject's eyes, a mix of fear and resignation. 3 days later, I saw my own nearly finished portrait. The details were perfect, down to the tiny scar on my eyebrow, the exact curve of my mouth, and there, faint but clear, were the outlines of the children in the background, as if they were part of my life, my story. That's when it hit me. Every child in his paintings had disappeared into the background of someone else's portrait. They weren't just models. They were stages in his process, fading from the main subject until they were gone. That night, I tried to leave. I packed my bag and crept downstairs, but the front door was locked with a heavy chain from the inside. I went for a window, nailed shut. The sound must have woken him, because suddenly he was there, blocking the hallway. "Where are you?" "Goin', lad." His tone was almost gentle, but his eyes were cold. I stammered something about needing air. He stepped closer. "We're not finished yet." The next day, he didn't let me out of the main room at all. I sat for him until my neck ached and my legs tingled from staying still. He kept muttering to himself, things like "the light's right now" and "almost there." When he finally stopped, it was dark outside. He told me to get some rest. I didn't. I waited until I heard him snoring upstairs, then crept down to the basement again. This time, I told the kids we were leaving. We moved as quietly as we could, but the girl accidentally knocked over a tin mug. The sound was deafening. The snoring stopped. He was on us in seconds, grabbing my arm so hard I felt his nails dig in. "You don't take what's mine," he hissed. I swung at him with the only thing in reach, a wooden stool. It hit his shoulder, not his head, but it was enough to make him stumble. I yelled at the kids to run. We scrambled up the stairs, through the kitchen, and toward the front door. The chain was still there, but I yanked it free so hard it broke a link. We spilled out into the street barefoot, running until my lungs burned. We didn't stop until we saw headlights, a passing car. I threw myself in front of it, waving my arms like a madman. The driver slammed the brakes, jumped out, and started yelling, but stopped when he saw the kids. We were taken to the police station, where I told them everything. At first, I thought they didn't believe me until they raided the house. They found the basement just as I described it, and more. A hidden crawl space filled with old canvases, dozens of them. Each one was dated. The oldest was from 1978. Every painting had a main subject, and in the background, always fading into the scenery, was a child. The further back in time, the more children there were in the backgrounds, until the early ones, where they were the main subjects. I didn't want to ask where those children were now. He was arrested that night. In court, they called him the orphan painter. They said he'd taken in homeless children for years, feeding them, keeping them alive just long enough to use them in his masterpiece series. Once a child had been painted into enough backgrounds, he'd remove them. They never said How? Maybe they didn't know, I testified. My hands shook the whole time. When they brought my painting in as evidence, I couldn't look at it. I already knew what was behind me in the picture, and I didn't want to see how close I'd been to disappearing forever. It's been years now. I don't paint. I don't even keep photographs in my house. I live in a small flat where every door locks from the inside, and I don't let anyone sketch me, not even for fun. Sometimes, when I pass a gallery, I'll glance at the portraits in the window and check the backgrounds, just in case. Because now I know the truth. Sometimes, the people in the background aren't just strangers. Sometimes, they're trapped there, waiting for someone to notice. Story number 6. I was shelving books when I first noticed her watching me. Not in a friendly, polite way, but with that sharp, fixed attention you only see when someone is studying you. She stood by the history section, one hand resting lightly on the shelf, her other clutching a small leather notebook. Her eyes flicked down to it every so often, then back to me, as if comparing me to something written inside. I remember thinking she might be one of those eccentric regulars, the kind who practically live in the library, so I smiled politely and went back to sorting the pile of returns. But the thing is, every time I moved to another section, she moved too. Never close enough to make a scene, but always there, always in my peripheral vision. It was mid-afternoon, quiet enough that you could hear the old heating pipes groaning through the walls. I was putting away an atlas when she finally approached. "Do you live nearby?" she asked, her voice calm, deliberate. I told her yes. "Just a few streets over." She nodded, jotting something in that little book. "And you work here full-time?" Another nod from me, more hesitant this time. She smiled faintly, thanked me, and walked away without another word. I shrugged it off, but that night, lying in bed, I kept seeing her face, pale, angular, eyes that seemed to weigh you rather than look at you. Over the next week, I saw her almost every day. Sometimes she'd read quietly at a table, sometimes she'd wander the aisles, always with that same notebook. Once, I passed close enough to hear the faint scratch of her pen. The writing was neat, almost impossibly small, as if she were trying to fit more onto each line than paper would allow. On Friday, she asked if I liked my job. I said yes, mostly. She asked if I ever took the bus or preferred walking home. I told her I walked. Her pen moved quickly over the page, and I felt a flicker of unease. By Monday, she knew my schedule. I'd arrive at 10, she'd already be there. If I took lunch, she took hers 5 minutes later. She asked stranger questions now, the name of my landlord, whether my parents were still alive, if I had ever broken a bone. I started giving vague answers, but she didn't seem bothered. She wrote anyway. I mentioned it to my co-worker Peter, who laughed and said, "Maybe she's writing a novel and you're the main character." I laughed too, but it didn't feel funny. 2 weeks in, I decided to test her. That morning, I parked my bike on a different street and entered through the side door. An hour later, she still found me. She stood at the end of the reference aisle, watching me slide a dictionary into place. "You didn't take your usual route today," she said, and it wasn't a question. Her tone wasn't accusing exactly, but there was something possessive in it, as if my movements belonged to her. I told her I was running late. She smiled, wrote something down, and left. That was the first day I felt genuine fear. The real break in my nerves came the following Saturday. I was alone on closing shift, stacking returned books in the back room, when I heard soft footsteps behind me. I turned, and there she was. Even though I hadn't seen her enter that day. "You're clumsy with your left hand," she said, eyes on mine, "but you've got good balance." I asked her what she was doing back there. The public wasn't allowed past the desk. She ignored the question and stepped closer. "Your father died when you were 9, she said. My stomach dropped. That wasn't public information, not unless you'd gone digging through records. "How do you know that?" I asked. She just tapped her notebook. "I write what I see, and what will be." I shoved past her and locked the staff door. She didn't follow, but I could hear her laughing softly on the other side. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were jagged flashes of her hand moving across the page. The next morning, I called the police. They took my statement politely, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. No threats, no assault, just a strange woman in a library. They said they'd keep an eye out. For a few days, she didn't show up. I started to breathe again. Then, on Thursday, there was an envelope on my doorstep. No name, just my address. In neat handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper torn from her notebook. It was my life. Bullet points, ages, events, from my birth to the present day. The last entry read, "Falls down apartment stairs, Friday evening, neck broken." My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. Friday was tomorrow. I didn't go to work the next day. I didn't leave my apartment at all. I double-locked the door, pushed furniture in front of it. By nightfall, I was pacing the living room, every creak of the building making me flinch. 11 o'clock came, midnight. No stairs, no accident. I told myself it was nonsense, that she was just trying to scare me. Round one, I finally sat down, exhausted, and started to doze. I woke to the sound of paper sliding under my door. I froze. There it was, lying on the floor, another torn page. This one started with the word revision written at the top. It described me waking up to investigate a sound in the hallway, tripping on something, hitting my head. My skin went cold. A faint tapping started at my door. Not pounding, tapping, like the tip of a pen. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After a minute, the tapping stopped. I stayed where I was until the sun came up. When I finally dared to open the door, the hallway was empty, but there was a small leather notebook sitting against the frame. My name was on the cover. Inside were dozens of pages about me, some going back to before I was born, and then the pages ahead, things I hadn't done yet. The handwriting was meticulous, and on the last page, in fresh ink, it said, "He burns the ledger." I don't know why I followed it. Maybe because I thought it was a way to end whatever this was. I took it to the kitchen, lit a match, and watched it catch. The paper curled and blackened, but the smoke smelled strange, metallic. As it burned, I felt this strange pulling sensation in my head, like memories being unspooled. My childhood, birthdays, my first kiss, the face of my father, all of it fading, slipping away. By the time the last page turned to ash, I couldn't remember my own middle name. I stayed inside for 3 days after that, barely eating. When I finally stepped outside, the city felt unfamiliar. Streets I'd walked for years looked wrong. Shopfronts had names I didn't recognize. People I passed didn't seem to know me. Even at the library, Peter frowned when I greeted him. "Sorry, do I know you?" he asked. My desk was occupied by someone else. There was no record I'd ever worked there. I kept telling myself I was just shaken, tired, imagining things. But a week later, I saw her again. She was sitting at an outdoor cafe, a fresh notebook in front of her. This time, she wasn't looking at me. She was watching a young woman at the next table, pen moving steadily across the page. I thought about warning her, but the words stuck in my throat. As I walked away, I realized I couldn't even remember the woman's face by the time I turned the corner. And deep down, I knew that whatever had been written about me was over. I was just another blank space in someone else's ledger. Story number 7. I didn't even want to go to that dinner. That's the part that sticks in my mind the most. If Hannah hadn't canceled on me last minute, I wouldn't have been alone in that restaurant at all. She texted just an hour before, saying her kid had a fever, and told me to go without her because you need a night out anyway. I almost stayed home. But I'd been working 12-hour shifts all week, and the thought of someone cooking me something I didn't have to think about felt like enough reason to leave the house. The place wasn't one I'd ever heard of before. A little bistro down a narrow lane in Christchurch called Dawn and Dusk. No signage except for a small brass plate on the door. You had to book weeks in advance, Hannah had said, but she'd somehow gotten us a table for one of their private dining experiences. When I got there, the host greeted me by name, which made my skin prickle a bit because I didn't remember giving it over the phone. He was a thin man with gray hair, combed so neatly it looked like a helmet, and he never broke eye contact, not once. As he took my coat, "You'll be in the chef's dining room," he said, like it was some privilege. The room wasn't what I expected. It was small, maybe 3 meters by 3. with a single table set right in the center. Just one chair. The walls were this dull, matte black, and in the corner was a swinging door. The kitchen. I assumed no music, no other diners. I sat down, feeling the strangeness of it immediately. The chef came out before I could get comfortable. He was tall, lean, and his hands were big. The kind of big that makes you imagine them around your throat. He introduced himself as Michel, but pronounced it like Michel. He shook my hand a beat too long, looking at me like he was already sizing me up. Tonight, he said, you will taste something rare. I will make each course myself and serve it to you directly. I laughed nervously and asked if there was a menu. No, he said, smiling just enough to show his teeth. Tonight is a trust exercise. The first course came on a square, white plate, thin slices of meat, almost translucent, with a drizzle of some dark sauce. The flavor was different, rich, but not like beef or lamb, softer somehow. I didn't want to be rude, so I just said, this is amazing. What is it? He grinned, but his eyes didn't move with his mouth. An old family recipe. That should have been my first real warning, but I didn't push. The second course was a small stew. The meat in it cut into perfect cubes, something about the way it chewed. It clung to my teeth. Michel stood in the corner as I ate, watching my mouth like he was studying every bite. I tried making conversation, asked where he was from, how long he'd been cooking, but his answers were short, always redirecting to, tell me what you taste. I said it was unlike anything I'd had before. His smile widened, but still no warmth in it. Halfway through, I realized something. The portions were tiny, a few bites each, and yet, I was already starting to feel heavy, like I'd eaten too much. There was this faint metallic tang under the flavors. My tongue kept flicking to the back of my teeth, and my stomach felt unsettled. When the third course came, I noticed his hands. The knuckles were red and raw, like he'd been scrubbing them hard. The dish was a single cut of meat, seared perfectly on the outside and pink in the center. I'd barely picked up my fork when I heard a sound from the kitchen. It wasn't the clatter of pans. It was a muffled thump, like something falling. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. Michel noticed, but didn't look back toward the kitchen. Eat, he said, softly but firmly. I don't know why I obeyed. Maybe because his voice had no room for discussion. I cut into the meat, and the knife slid through too easily. I chewed, and the flavor hit me like a shock, deep, almost sweet, but something about it made my throat tighten. The metallic aftertaste was stronger now. My eyes flicked toward the kitchen door again, and that's when I saw it swing just enough to catch a glimpse of something. A pale hand, limp, hanging from what looked like a hook. I dropped my fork. It clanged against the plate, breaking the silence in a way that made my heart race. Michel's face didn't change, but his voice dropped lower. Is something wrong? I said I wasn't feeling well, that maybe I should just pay and go. He stepped closer to the table. No, you must finish. It is tradition. His shadow loomed over me, stretching across the table like a net. I mumbled something about an emergency, stood up, and tried to move toward the door. He didn't block me, but his eyes followed me like a predator's. As I reached for my coat, the kitchen door swung again. This time, I saw enough. A steel table, red-streaked, a head of long brown hair fanned across it, attached to someone. Very, very still. My hand froze on the coat rack. I felt my pulse in my teeth. Michel stepped into the doorway, blocking my view. His arms loose at his sides, but his presence filling the space. Leaving already, he said. His tone wasn't angry, but there was an edge to it, the kind of edge that says you don't get to decide this. I lied. I said I had a sick relative to check on, that I'd come back another night. His eyes searched mine, like he was deciding whether I was worth the trouble. Then, almost casually, he said, perhaps you would like dessert to take with you. I nodded too quickly, hoping to appease him. He disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard something, not the clink of dishes, but the scrape of metal. My legs were shaking. I told myself I had seconds, maybe less. I grabbed my coat, turned, and walked, not ran, to the front door. My hand closed around the handle just as I heard him call out, "You have a very good palate. I will remember it." The lock turned harder than it should have, but it opened. cold air hit me like a slap, and I stepped out onto the empty lane, forcing myself not to look back. I walked fast until the corner, then broke into a run. I didn't stop until I reached a lit street with people and traffic. When I got home, I went straight to the bathroom and threw up until my throat burned. The taste clung to my mouth no matter how many times I brushed my teeth. I barely slept that night, every creak of the house making me think I'd see his tall frame in the doorway. The next day, I called the police. They said they'd look into it, but their tone made it clear they thought I was just a panicked diner who'd misread a situation. Still, I insisted, described the hand, the body on the table. They took my statement, but nothing came of it. A week later, I passed by that lane, dawn and dusk was gone. The brass plate had been removed, the windows boarded over. For months afterward, I'd catch the scent of seared meat in the most random places, walking past a cafe, opening my fridge, and every time, my stomach would knot. I stopped eating red meat entirely, couldn't do it. The texture, the taste, even the sight of it in a supermarket tray made my chest tighten. It's been years now. I still don't know where he went, or who the person in the kitchen was. Sometimes I think about what he said. I will remember it, and I wonder if that was a promise or a threat. Every so often, I check local news from other cities, looking for stories about missing diners, strange private restaurants, chefs who serve rare dishes. I've never found anything that clearly matches him, but a part of me knows he's still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next person to walk into his dining room alone. And the worst part? Some nights when I'm lying in bed and my guard's down, I can still taste it. Not the sauce, not the seasoning, just that underlying flavor, that soft, sweet wrongness. And every time I do, I remember the weight of his stare as I chewed. I don't tell people this part often, but I'll tell you when I took that first bite of the main course, before I saw the hand, before I even suspected. There was a fleeting moment when I thought it was the best thing I'd ever eaten. And that's what keeps me awake, because I know deep down, if I hadn't looked toward the kitchen, I might have finished every last bite. Story number 8. I remember gripping the bus ticket so tightly it bent in my hand. The woman in the seat beside me kept looking over, probably wondering why I was sweating when the bus was barely half full. I told myself it was just nerves, that going to Brno was the best thing I'd done in months. The man who'd given me the ticket, Tomas, had promised good money, free accommodation, and work that didn't require me to speak much Czech, just basic warehouse stuff. He'd said we'd met 2 weeks earlier in a soup kitchen in Bratislava. He wore a charity volunteer badge, the kind you see at street donation drives. When I got off the bus, Tomas was already waiting, leaning against an old white van. He smiled like we were old friends. You made it, he said, shaking my hand hard. His grip was warm, but it lingered a bit too long. The smell of his cologne hit me cheap and strong. We drove without talking much, just the hum of the tires and the occasional rattle of tools in the back. I asked about the job, and he just said, "Everything will be explained tonight. You'll be fine." The building we arrived at wasn't a warehouse. It was an old brick structure with no windows on the ground floor, tucked behind a chain link fence. The inside smelled faintly metallic, like rust mixed with hospital disinfectant. A tall woman in a nurse's uniform greeted me. Her eyes were so pale they looked almost colorless. She didn't introduce herself, just nodded and told me to follow. I glanced at Tomas, but he was already walking away toward a side door. I was taken to a small dorm-style room with a single bed, a metal locker, and nothing else. Rest. The woman said flatly, "We work late here." That night, I lay in bed listening. Through the thin walls, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy enough to make the frame of the bed tremble slightly. Every so often, a metallic clink echoed down the hall, like surgical instruments being laid out. Around midnight, Tomas came in and woke me. "Time to earn," he said, tossing me a set of blue overalls. I followed him down a hallway lined with locked doors. From one, I heard a muffled groan. I slowed down, but Tomas glanced back sharply. "Keep moving." The room we entered was freezing. A bright surgical light hung overhead, making everything feel unreal. In the center was a stainless steel table with restraints. There was a man lying there barefoot, eyes darting wildly. His mouth gagged. His skin looked sickly pale, and there were fresh needle marks along his arms. My stomach tightened. I turned to Tomas, but he was busy pulling on gloves. Hold his legs, he told me. I thought this was warehouse work. I said. My voice cracked. It is, he said calmly, except the goods are inside the people. I froze. The nurse appeared, wheeling in a tray. She didn't even glance at me. On it were scalpels, forceps, and stainless steel bowls. The man on the table started thrashing, his muffled cries getting louder. I backed away, but Tomas moved. Closer, his face suddenly hard. You work, or you don't leave here at all. I can't remember deciding to grab the door handle. My body just did it, but it didn't turn. It was locked from the outside. I was trapped. For the next 2 hours, I watched in a haze of shock as they cut into that man. I couldn't look directly, but I could hear everything: the soft suction sounds, the metal clinking into the bowl, the wet thump when something vital was removed. The nurse and Tomas worked in eerie silence, like this was just routine. When it was over, Tomas told me to drag the body into the cold room at the end of the hall. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, but I did it. The cold room was lined with steel drawers. I counted at least 20. Each one had a number written in black marker. I didn't open them. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing the man's muffled cries in my head. At dawn, I decided I had to get out, but there were cameras in the hallway and a padlock on the main exit. I needed a key. The next evening, they brought in another patient, this time a young woman, maybe 20, her hair matted with sweat. She looked straight at me, and I knew she understood I wasn't one of them. Her lips moved under the gag. She was begging. Something in me snapped when Tomas stepped out to take a phone call. I reached for the tray and grabbed the heaviest instrument I could find, a bone saw. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. The nurse noticed too late. I swung, catching her in the side of the head. She went down instantly, blood pooling on the tiles. The young woman's wrists were strapped with thick leather belts. I fumbled with the buckles, my hands slick with sweat. She whispered something in another language, maybe Romanian. I just kept saying, "We're leaving." I didn't even know if I believed it. Tomas's footsteps echoed closer. I yanked the gag out of the woman's mouth and told her to run the moment the door opened. When Tomas stepped back inside, his eyes went wide, not with fear, but with anger. Like I'd just broken a rule. He lunged. We collided hard, and the saw clattered across the floor. He was stronger, but desperation made me fight like an animal. My hand found the nurse's dropped keyring. I kicked him in the knee and bolted. The woman followed, barefoot, her breathing ragged. The first key I tried didn't work. The second did. We ran out into the night, through a side gate left half open. I didn't dare look back. We ran until the city lights swallowed us. We found a small police station on the edge of town. The officer on duty looked skeptical until the woman rolled up her sleeve and showed fresh stitches along her ribs. They took her to a hospital. They kept me for hours, asking the same questions over and over. Where the building was, who was inside, how many victims I'd seen. A raid happened that night. They found 4 people alive in that building and 16 bodies in the cold room. Tomas was gone. The nurse was dead. I left Brno the next day with nothing but the clothes I'd arrived in. I never found out what happened to the young woman. Sometimes I wonder if she made it home, if she even had one to go to for months. I couldn't sleep without seeing that table, that bright light, that steel bowl filling slowly. I try to tell myself I did what I could, but in my head, I still hear the man from the first night, thrashing, begging through the gag. And here's the part I never told the police: when I was in that cold room, dragging the man's body to a drawer, I glanced down at the number on the tag tied to his toe. It wasn't a random number. It was a date, my date of birth. Story number 9. I was halfway through my math workbook when I noticed him staring again. Always from the same seat, back corner of the classroom, eyes fixed just a little too long. His name was Haruto. Small kid, thin, with hair that hung over his forehead like he didn't want anyone to see him. I didn't think much of it at first. There's always someone a little odd in every class. But it wasn't just staring. Sometimes his lips would move, like he was whispering my name, but no sound came out. One day after school, I forgot my pencil case and went back to grab it. The room was empty except for him. He was standing by the window, holding something white. It looked like a sheet of paper, but when he turned, I saw it had eye holes cut out perfectly shaped like mine. I laughed nervously, asked what it was. He didn't answer, just folded it in half, slipped it into his bag, and walked out. That was the first time I felt cold. The next week, strange things started happening. My desk would be moved a few inches from where I left it. My shoes in the cubby swapped for another pair identical to mine, but worn and dirt-stained. Once, I found a piece of paper tucked in my history book. It was a face, my face, drawn in such detail it looked like a black and white photograph, except the eyes were too round, to the alert, like I'd been caught mid-breath. I started avoiding Haruto. If he came into the room, I'd find a reason to leave, but it didn't stop. One day, during gym class, my friend Aiko whispered to me, "Don't look now, but he's behind the storage shed." Of course, I looked. He was standing half in shadow, holding another one of those paper faces. This one wasn't mine. It looked like Satoshi from our class. Satoshi didn't come to school the next day. We were told he was visiting relatives, but I overheard the teachers whispering that his parents had reported him missing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Haruto's blank expression and those paper masks. I tried telling my parents. They brushed it off. "Kids make weird art," my dad said. "Don't be dramatic." So I kept it to myself. But 2 days later, I found another paper face in my bag. This one was colored skin tone, dark eyes, a faint pink flush on the cheeks. And it wasn't paper anymore. It was thicker, slightly soft. When I ran my finger along the edge, I swear I felt tiny ridges like pores. I threw it away, but that didn't make me feel better. Then came the night I woke up to the sound of paper crinkling. At first, I thought it was a dream, but it kept going, a slow, deliberate folding. I sat up, heart hammering, and there he was, standing at the foot of my bed. Haruto. He was holding something in both hands, but I couldn't see it clearly. My throat closed up. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He tilted his head slightly, like he was measuring me. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "Almost finished," and he left. The next morning, my parents found the front door unlocked. They thought it was me. I didn't tell them. I didn't want to explain. But at school, Haruto wasn't there. Neither was Aiko. Her bag was still in her cubby, shoes neatly placed underneath. That afternoon, I found two paper faces taped to the back of my desk. One was Aiko's, the other, mine. I couldn't take it anymore. I stayed late after school, pretending to work on homework, just to see where he went. Round dusk, he slipped out and headed toward the old supply building near the back gate. No one used it anymore. It smelled of mildew and was stacked with broken desks and chairs. I waited until he disappeared inside, then followed. The smell hit me first, something sour and metallic. The only light came from a single desk lamp in the corner. He was there, hunched over a table, working on something. I crept closer, trying not to breathe. On the table were neat stacks of paper, brushes, jars of glue, and faces, dozens of them, hanging from strings like grotesque laundry. Not just drawings, these had texture, depth. The mouths were open just enough to see pink inside. Then I saw it. Aiko's face, perfect, down to the tiny mole on her jawline. But it wasn't paper, it was skin. I backed up too quickly and knocked over a chair. He spun around. For the first time, I saw his eyes clearly. They were flat, empty, like glass marbles. He didn't speak, just reached for something under the table. I turned and ran. My foot caught on a loose floorboard, and I fell hard, scraping my knee. He was right behind me. I scrambled up, bolted out the door, and didn't stop until I reached the main road. I went straight to the police station. They didn't believe me at first until they searched the supply building. But by then, it was empty. No faces, no glue, just dust and broken furniture. They questioned Haruto, but without evidence, they let him go. His parents claimed he'd been home all evening. Over the next month, 3 more students vanished. No one connected it to him. No one except me. I started seeing him in places he shouldn't be outside my cram school, at the corner store where my mother shops, standing by the vending machines near my bus stop, always holding something white in his hands, always watching. Then, one evening, my mother called me to the kitchen. "Someone left this for you," she said, holding an envelope. Inside was a single paper face, mine, only this time, it was smiling. A wide, unnatural smile that showed every tooth. There was a note taped to the back, for words, "This one fits perfectly." That night, I locked every door and window, pushed my desk against the bedroom door, and sat with a kitchen knife in my lap. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke to a strange silence, the kind that presses in, heavy and unnatural. I reached for the knife. It was gone. My desk was pushed back to its original place, and on my pillow was the paper face, still smiling. I screamed for my parents, but when they came in, the face was gone. They thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was, but I knew what I saw. I started carrying scissors everywhere, even to school. If he came near me, I'd be ready. It was 2 weeks later. When I got my chance, I was leaving cram school late, the streets quiet except for my footsteps. I heard the faint sound of paper folding. My skin prickled. I turned, and there he was, stepping out from a narrow alley. The white mask in his hands gleamed under the streetlight. "Almost finished," he said again, just like that night in my room. I didn't wait. I ran at him, scissors open, and slashed the mask in half. Something warm splattered my hand, not glue, not paint. He dropped the pieces and stumbled back, clutching his wrist. I didn't stay to see if it was enough. I ran until I saw the lights of the train station, people, noise, safety. The next day, Haruto wasn't in class. He never came back. No one knew why, no one except me. And yet, sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of paper folding. I tell myself it's nothing, just my imagination. But last week, when I opened my locker, there was an envelope inside, my name written in perfect handwriting. And when I opened it, I found a new face, mine again. But this time, the smile was wider, and the eyes weren't mine anymore. Story number 10. I was halfway through my croissant when I saw him again, standing at the edge of the pier, camera to his eye, same as the week before. Same thick navy coat, same stiff posture, like the cold didn't bother him at all. He wasn't taking pictures of the ocean or the boats. His lens was aimed straight at a woman sitting on the low wall, sipping from a paper cup. She laughed at something on her phone, and he just stood there, clicking, adjusting, clicking again. I remember thinking it was weird, but La Rochelle's full of odd characters. You learn not to stare. 2 weeks later, I saw him again. Same pier, same time, just before sunrise. This time it was a couple, arms locked, their faces barely visible in the dim light. He took maybe a dozen shots before lowering the camera, watching them walk away like he was memorizing their steps. And then when they were gone, he left too, slipping into the maze of narrow streets toward the old dockyards. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was an artist. Maybe he was writing a book. But the thing that stuck in my head wasn't his photographing, it was the way he never smiled. Not once. I wouldn't have thought about him again if it hadn't been for the news. A woman found dead in her flat on Rue du Temple. No signs of forced entry, strangled. They showed her picture, same woman I'd seen laughing on the wall that morning with the paper cup. My stomach flipped. It had been exactly a day after I'd seen her. I didn't connect it right away, but when the couple turned up dead 2 weeks later, stabbed in their own kitchen, my hands went cold. I started going to the pier on purpose after that. I told myself it was just curiosity, but deep down I think I was waiting to see if he'd be there again. And he was, always there just before dawn, always picking one person, sometimes two. He never rushed. Sometimes he'd wait half an hour before lifting the camera. I'd watch from the benches, pretending to check my phone. And every single person he photographed was on the news the next day, dead. The police didn't mention anything about photographs, just no suspects, and investigation ongoing. I thought about going to them, but what could I say? I didn't have proof, just a man with a camera and a bad feeling in my gut. I didn't even know his name the morning I saw him photograph. The girl in the red scarf was the morning I made the mistake. She was young, maybe 20, leaning against the railing and watching the fishing boats come in. He was closer to her this time, 10 meters at most, and I saw him adjust his focus, fire off 3 quick shots, then lower the camera. Something in my chest twisted. I couldn't just let her walk off like the others. When she left the pier, I followed her. She headed up Rue St. Nicholas, past the shuttered shops. She had headphones in. I caught up and tapped her shoulder. She pulled one earbud out, looking confused. I told her quietly that she should be careful, that I thought someone was following her. She frowned, glanced back toward the water, then laughed a little. "It's fine. My uncle's here. He's taking pictures." Her uncle. My throat went dry. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. I kept picturing his face, not the girl's uncle, but the man at the pier, and wondering if he knew I'd noticed him. The next morning, the girl in the red scarf wasn't in the news. Not that day. Not the day after. I started to think maybe I'd been wrong. But on the third morning, there she was, found in an alley near the fish market. The police said it was a robbery gone wrong. By then, I knew he'd seen me watching him. The fourth time I went to the pier, he looked right at me. Not a glance, he locked eyes, and it was like he was taking my picture without the camera. Then he smiled. First time I'd ever seen him do it. My whole body went cold. I didn't go back for a week. I kept checking behind me when I walked home from work, kept the chain on my door. But curiosity has a way of digging under your skin. One morning, I found myself back at the water. No sign of him. I stayed longer than usual, scanning every corner. When I finally turned to leave, he was standing at the far end of the pier, camera dangling from his neck. "Morning," he said. As I passed, his voice was calm, almost friendly. I mumbled something back and kept walking, but he followed, just a step behind. I could hear the click of his shoes on the wood, steady, deliberate. When I stopped to tie my shoe, he stopped too. When I started walking again, so did he. I took a turn toward the cafe, hoping for a crowd, but the street was empty. My heartbeat was so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. He didn't say another word, just stayed behind me until I reached my building. I fumbled with my keys, got inside, and slammed the door. Through the peephole, I saw him standing there for maybe 20 seconds before walking away. That night, I decided I had to leave La Rochelle. I packed a bag, booked a train for the next morning. But at 4 a.m., I woke up to a sound, soft, deliberate, coming from the direction of my door. Not knocking, more like a metal against metal. I froze, holding my breath. Then it stopped. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The sun was just starting to rise when I reached the station. The platform was almost empty. I kept scanning the faces, waiting to see that navy coat. When the train pulled in, I exhaled for the first time in hours. I found my seat, dropped my bag, and closed my eyes. When I opened them again, he was sitting across from me, camera on his lap, smiling. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The train jolted forward, and he leaned in just a little. "You watch people," he said softly, "but you don't understand them." I swallowed, trying to find my voice. "Why are you doing this?" He tilted his head like the question confused him. "It's not doing, it's keeping. They're gone, but I have them forever, before the day ruins them." I told him I'd go to the police. He shrugged. "They won't find anything. I don't keep pieces, just moments." His eyes flicked to the window. "And now, I have yours." I didn't realize until later that he'd taken the camera in his hands while he said it. Lens pointed at me, the faint click almost lost under the train's rumble. We sat like that for the rest of the ride. I couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't make him worse. When the train stopped at Nantes, he stood, slung the camera over his shoulder, and stepped off without looking back. I waited for hours before continuing my trip, changing trains twice just in case. I moved in with my cousin in Marseille, told her I'd lost my job and needed a fresh start. I never mentioned him. I thought maybe distance would be enough. 2 weeks later, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a single photograph of me, sitting on that train, eyes wide, mouth slightly open like I'd just seen something I couldn't explain. The light from the window caught my face perfectly. Underneath, in neat handwriting, was one word: preserved. I burned the photo. But sometimes when I wake up before dawn, I can almost hear the click of his camera again.